So we appreciate your being here because this is a critical issue that we're going to look into, because I think that this, the social media component has really defined ISIS as we know it across the globe, because they have been exposed so much. I want to introduce the panelists. We have Zanab Ahmed, who's with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of New York. She's Deputy Chief of National Security and Cybercrime, and she's prosecuted a number of terrorists and terrorism cases. We have Patrick Skinner on the end. He's with the Sufan Group. He was a former CIA case agent, also specializing in developing sources and handling sources for use in counterterrorism. We've got Matthew Maraglia, who is an FBI supervisory special agent, and he's also on the JTTF, focused on fighting online terrorism. And you had a role also in the Boston Marathon, processing the evidence in the case against Jahar Tsarnaev. We also have Daphna Linzer, who's an award-winning investigative reporter. She's managing editor of MSNBC.com, and she specializes in national security as well as intelligence and nonproliferation, and she did that as a reporter both for the Washington Post and for the AP. So when we talk about social media and the use of social media, one thing that we all see, and that is just how well ISIS has been able to package its message and promote its propaganda. And it's not just about what we see on Twitter or Facebook. They're using it for recruitment, for self-promotion, for propaganda, to instill fear, a fear that may be out of proportion, as well as connecting with each other online. So all of those are components of what we're seeing social media used for. And Matt, I want to start with you, and that is the impact of this campaign that they're waging in recruitment. How has that elevated their role and their presence, not physically so much as mentally? Because psychologically, they're not mounting just a ground offensive. They're also on a digital assault.
Sure. ISIS in particular has used social media and digital media to an extent that we have never seen before. They're much better at it than previous versions of extremists, than Al-Qaeda, than even other earlier versions of ISIS, of whatever they were. They really know how to speak to the people via social media. I mean, we would be well pressed to have a representative from Madison Avenue here on how to brand something in the digital age. That's what they are. This is their medium. That's how they speak. They know who they're speaking to. The people they're speaking to, their medium is also social media. Most of us grew up without the internet, without the World Wide Web, certainly without Twitter, Facebook, everything else. The people they target, to them, this is how they communicate. This is what they do. So they know that, and they know how to exploit it. And it's widespread beyond anything we've seen before.
Which is also very interesting, and I want to ask Zanab this question. That is, you know, when you think of Al-Qaeda, and you think of Adam Gadon, which was an American from California, and he's the one who runs their social media department. The message that Al-Qaeda has been trying to put out ever since Osama bin Laden almost has taken a secondary role to the message that we're hearing. You've prosecuted some of these terrorists. You've seen how they think. How significant is getting this message out and the impact it has on them to follow the message that's being espoused?
Well, let me quickly start by saying that my views are just mine and not that of the Department of Justice here today. But I think that Al-Qaeda's media goals are really no different from ISIS's media goals. I think that a lot of the difference you see in Al-Qaeda's media, Al-Qaeda's historical media operation and ISIS's current media operation is that of time and technology and access. So terrorist use of the internet is increasing and increasing in its volume and its sophistication as terrorist access to the internet is increasing. Terrorist use of film production technologies is getting better as terrorist access to those technologies is getting better. Al-Qaeda also filmed propaganda videos throughout its history. They released one, very well-known one, after the attack on the USS Cole, others after 9/11. A lot of the famous pronouncements from bin Laden and Zawahiri that we're all familiar with having seen over the past couple of decades were presented by Al-Qaeda's As-Sahab media arm. And the reason that those things look slicker today is because technology has made it so that you can film a slick video with a phone and you don't need a big camera on your shoulder.
Which gets to the next point, and I will ask Daphne this question, and that is, when you think of who's doing this, have we sort of undermined, look, there's a little bit of an arrogance, I think, because for me, I know, I think of Al-Qaeda and I think of Osama bin Laden in a cave, okay? And I think on some levels, now that they're coming out and using the exact same social media that's being used very actively in the West by so many people, do you think we simply just undermined their sophistication? We underestimated perhaps the enemy and their ability to do what everybody around the world is really doing, those who have access to these computers and to these phones.
Yeah, I think a little bit taking off what Zainab said is that they're really good at social media, and we've all gotten better at social media, and social media is growing, so our access to it is as well, and so is theirs. I think one of the things that I've noticed that's changing, I think, and with ISIS in particular, really is impact. And I say that because, NBC News, we did a poll. One of the questions was about the beheadings and the videos and the beheading of James Foley, and 94% of Americans had heard of the beheading of James Foley, which is extraordinary that nearly 100% of the American public would have heard of a single news event that happened very far away involving a single person. In a complicated story in many ways. And so, to me, that was just enormous impact, and that is, I think, a very big difference. The other impact, I think, is fear. The same poll showed that nearly 50% of Americans today think the country is less safe than it was thinking back just before the attacks of September 11th, 2001. So I think with social media and with the improvements in technology also becomes a change in impact in the way they can reach people and the way they can frighten the country. And I think that has huge impact on our policies and the decisions we make based on the fears that people are feeling.
Which is sort of goes to the point that Peter Bergen made just before lunch, which is so many people think ISIS is a direct threat to the United States, when in fact it may be more of a direct threat overseas and not here. So then let me ask you, Patrick, in terms of that message and that message being put out there, it's very interesting because Al Jazeera refused to show the beheading of the second victim, Stephen Sotloff. They simply refused. And then they also tried to impose a media ban with a hashtag ISIS. I'll find it. It's in my notes somewhere.
ISIS, yeah.
It was ISIS.
Media blackout.
ISIS media blackout. Yeah. It was ISIS media blackout. Mm-hmm. Do you think that on some levels, again, what I find, there's sort of this double impact, this double whammy. ISIS will put something out, some piece of propaganda, and then what happens is mainstream media picks it up. Mm-hmm. So not only is it getting a first run, it's getting a second run, a third run. It all depends on how long the news cycle is. Do you think that there should be some sort of social responsibility in terms of how we rebroadcast the messaging?
Well, I think that the hashtag media blackout was more aimed, obviously, for the media. And so you got to separate that from the effectiveness of their message. ISIS is not broadcasting for the media. They're broadcasting for that 0.5% that is vulnerable, can radicalize by watching these violent images. They don't know who they are, which is incredibly hard to counter. They just know that they can play the percentages. But when it comes to the media, yeah, there's some kind of responsibility, because when 80% of the American public has saw, an image of the video, that tells you it's everywhere. Now, and that's important for policy, because policy is driven by public pressure. And so the public pressure is way out of proportion to the threat in some ways, and so that makes for bad policy, which would then lead to more bad decisions. But it's important to note that we talk about the media and everyone in this room, and we can say, oh, this is effective and we should do this. They are not talking to us. They do not care what we say. They like it if we talk about them and we get scared, but they're aiming for these 14 to 25-year-old disaffective youth, and they're just playing the odds. So it's like two separate issues.
So that's okay. So let's explore that a little bit, because if it is two separate issues, what ends up happening is they may be trying to reach people, but the message, I think, is being magnified by the repetition. Matthew, how do you see the sort of complexities of social media and its scope and its scale?
I think on social media what happens is you allow them to somewhat get into an echo chamber as well of their beliefs. They're only going to follow who they want to follow. Whatever people post on Facebook is what they want to post on Facebook. So it's not like traditional media that has a job and values the truth and getting out both sides of the story. They don't have to worry about that. and they can pick and choose online what they believe and what they think is true and what they think is not. So they're going to follow who they want, and then they just get those beliefs reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. So no matter how many outlets carry the story about a beheading, they're only going to go to the outlets or their friends that carry the beheading in the way that they see it. We're all guilty of that to an extent. It's like Patrick said, when you're 14, you're really only going to listen to what you want to hear, no matter what your parents say. And the parents in this case would be the news media, the government, things like that.
Does it make it, so actually, Zanab, in terms of prosecuting a case, do you find that, social media is also open source, and so there are a lot of reports and a lot of stories that it's being watched, it's being monitored. Has there ever been a case where you were able to use social media to try to help prosecute a case or track down a lead or get you to the next level?
Yes, certainly. I think that people's comments on social media have, if they are good evidence of their intent or actions, been used against them in criminal trials. I should say that not all social media is open source in the sense of being just available to anybody trolling the internet. So if something is public, and certain groups do have public Facebook pages, then certainly anything that's posted on that can be viewed and used by law enforcement. But things that are on people's private pages take court orders in order to view. So you would need, for example, to get a search warrant for somebody's Facebook accounts to see their messages or contacts or any content of that account. So it's not just that it doesn't necessarily make it all the more easier to access. You still need your traditional court orders and tools to allow searches into certain forums, but those are statements of intent and evidence of actions. We're talking about photos and things like that, just like any other category, and we've certainly used them as such.
And in terms of when you think of what you've seen, for example, Daphne, online, what are some of the things that you sort of have looked at and whether it's resonated or it hasn't resonated with you, or if you're inside the mind of a 14 to 30-year-old who really is intent on doing something, where do you see the greatest impact in some of these images?
So I think the question here, it sort of sounds like we're getting to propaganda versus recruitment.
Right, and there are different areas.
Right.
It's being used in different ways.
Right,
so.
and sort of how these, how social media is playing out. I mean, I was interested in either Matthew or Patrick were saying, we're not the audience for the propaganda part, but I think for recruitment, and I'm interested in what everyone else has to say on the panel too, but it does seem to be having a pretty interesting impact on recruitment and also just kind of on inspiration in very different ways from what we saw a decade ago, 12 years ago, in looking at the way Al-Qaeda was using the internet then, when we talked about a very influential cleric posting an essay that people would read to find inspiration from, or the idea of having to send somebody to a training camp, maybe is inspired to go somewhere to learn some technique to carry out an attack. I think if you look at the attack in Ottawa, for example, that person may never have needed to know anything about anyone at ISIS or have any access to ever being in Syria or Iraq to be able to carry out an attack like that. And so I think that is one of the things for me when thinking about social media and reach in kind of a newer age of ISIS and recruitment playing into that. And just like the idea of fans, I think, out there, I find really interesting of young women fans of that kind of sort of celebrity tinge that some social media has sometimes in attracting people and being able to follow whoever you want. I mean, I think that's just a different flavor in terms of recruiting and influencing than we saw 12 years ago when we weren't where we are now with social media and reach.
One of the interesting things is when we were talking to John Miller during the break, and one thing he said is, we focus on these individuals, we focus on the lone wolves, and do you find them? How do you find them? Do we pay more attention to that as opposed to interrupting a cell? And the one thing he said is, look, you've got to focus not necessarily on the individuals, you've got to focus on the ideology, you've got to figure out who is the new inspiring, the inspiration, whether it's an al-Awlaki, who's doing the messaging. Patrick, from your work, what do you see as, how do you try to counter the message that's getting out there? And is that even possible? The State Department tried, and they got a little bit pilloried for it.
Yeah, I have a kind of a contrarian view on countering messages online. There is a huge role for countering violent extremism. But when it comes to cyberspace, I believe that the best counter violent extremism for cyberspace is anything but cyber. Because trying to appeal to the goodness of a teenager is maddening, as you all understand. And Twitter is perfectly suited, 140 characters to explain an impulsive act. It's perfect. And so to try to be rational and to sell good, that works for kids when you're doing a Disney movie, but it doesn't work for a 14-year-old. That's why they don't go see romantic comedies, they go see car chases. And so I think for a cyber platform, it's almost impossible to counter the natural urge for bad impulse control and violent imagery. It's an age-old thing. This is just a new medium, and the reach, as they were talking about, is infinite. So you have to understand this reach is infinite. And so the best approach is anything but cyber. Get them to do anything, swim, soccer, talk, anything away from the computer. But you make a great point about spokesman. Anwar al-Awlaki was a really persuasive spokesman, and he could inspire people. The problem now is, with ISIS, and then whoever follows him will be even better than they are, is that the idea of a spokesman is a quaint notion. They think it's kind of funny. I mean, Adnani probably wouldn't because that's his job and he's paid for it. But they crowdsource their message. And so the idea of a spokesman, if you got rid of one spokesman, it wouldn't matter because they're crowdsourcing it. The average ISIS supporter has like 500 followers, which is a lot more than I have. And so, and if you get rid of him, that's okay because they have infinite reach. Now, talent still rises. And so if you get rid of the talented people and block them or use satire, which some countries are now doing pretty effectively, that's a really effective way. But countering the message online, I think, is a hopeless task.
Can you elaborate a little bit more when you say some countries are using satire? Are they simply making fun? Are they mocking? Are they, what are they trying to do?
They walk a pretty cool line. Iraq has a couple TV shows that are really good. And it's not mocking, because no one likes to be mocking, and like political campaigns, there's a difference between satire and mocking. And so they use satire. They highlight the banality of it, or the insanity of it, or the humor of just skewing it a little bit. And so they do like Monty Python type skits. There's a British movie that came out last year called Four Kings that is about as a perfect counter-extremism movie as you could ever see, because it highlights the absurdity of what they're trying to do. But it doesn't make fun of the individuals, because the people that you want to impact, they're vulnerable. They're the ones that are falling for this message. So if you say anybody who falls for this message is an idiot, you've just called your target audience an idiot, and they shut down, just like your parents would do. And so if you just highlight the absurdity or the difficulty of it, which is like how smoking didn't start going down because of anti-smoking commercials. It went down because it slowly got less cool because it got a lot more expensive and people were dying. And at the end, it was a prima facie case. And this will be too.
So Matthew, one of the things that the director said today, he said that they're broadcasting in 23 different languages, that they've really raised their global brand. Do you think that and again, when you look at, just trying to get a handle of how they're using social media so effectively to really make them seem much larger, much more sort of, again, we see the beheadings, the crucifixions, the executions that are going on. How do you look at that and say, well, it's this big or it's this big, depending on whether you're watching social media?
Well, I mean, social media is as big as the internet, right? We like to say the world is getting smaller. That's because the internet is getting bigger. I mean, everyone is on there. And part of what happens, they're able to broadcast in 23 languages, is that unlike Al-Qaeda core before them, ISIS has managed to attract every possible subset of extremists to them. Chechens will travel there, Europeans will travel there, Africans will travel there, Americans, Canadians, everyone travels there. So they kind of have an in-house team that knows how to reach out to their base target audience. It's much what like the US government does. We're an immigration melting pot in the United States, so we bring in everyone we can and we know how to target different audiences. They're just very good at it. So as the internet reaches out among new platforms, before you really only had Facebook, now you have Facebook, now you have Twitter, now you have Tango and any multitude of other social apps. Those expand the reach into someone that might not have Twitter, They might have Tumblr. They might not have Facebook. They might have Ask.fm or something like that. So they've expanded into the multiple different arenas of social media online, and they have a stronger internal pool to pull from to hit each various ethnic group, we'll call them for lack of a better term, to hit it that way. So they've expanded in multiple ways, and the internet is just the best way to get that out. They're not going to robocall people in different countries.
You know, I was very surprised, and I don't know if others were also to hear, but again, one of the figures that Ali Soufan gave today was that you've got Tunisians, Saudis, Turks. Who are the other two big groups?
Moroccans and Jordanians.
Moroccans and Jordanians. So, which is interesting, is the social messaging being directed to those audiences as well, or is it more tailored, and I'll ask you, Patrick, this since it's your group, is it more tailored to sort of Western ideology, the French, the Americans, the Australians, the Germans?
It varies. Facebook is big in the Levant. Tumblr is actually big in the Gulf. And then in Iraq and in Turkey, I guess, a little, they use Twitter. But for the most part, ISIS Twitter is aimed at the West. They use Just Paste It, which is a file sharing. It's like an open source Dropbox. And so they'll put a link up and say, which is how the Foley video and the Sotloff video came out. They say, okay, here's the link for Just Paste It. And then everyone goes there, and then it's impossible to shut down. And so it is tailored. The problem is there's been a 4-year civil war in this area, and so they don't really have to rely too much on Twitter and Facebook because it's right next door, it is constant, it's everything they see, their societies are being disrupted by it. Twitter, I found, is more Western focused for ISIS. And then al-Nusra, and that's in English, oddly enough. ISIS spends a lot of time, in 23 languages, but a lot of it is in English. Al-Nusra is almost entirely in Arabic. And it's so they're targeting very different. And ISIS is definitely targeting the West.
Okay. Just to follow up on that, are they getting more recruits? Is al-Nusra getting more recruits than, for example, ISIS? Or not that anybody knows? It's hard to run those numbers, but...
Yeah, oddly enough, the way that we're getting these numbers is from social media. A lot of these foreign fighter numbers that you get are because they're self-identifying themselves and they're telling their family. Then so you can scrub social media and see that. So it's unknown how many Arabic-speaking fighters are going to al-Nusra. Al-Nusra is more of a Syrian fighter, kind of a domestic group right now, and ISIS is over half foreign fighters. So social media plays probably a bigger role for ISIS than it does al-Nusra.
And so now this is kind of interesting because Iraq, one of the things that they noticed is as ISIS began to get closer to Baghdad, they're about 40 miles out of Baghdad, all of a sudden Facebook went down, Twitter went down. You had far fewer people who were able to access it. And Facebook and Twitter said, no, we're fine. It's not on our end. Do you think on some levels, and again, not to speak for the government, but on some ways, when you see that they're getting this kind of access, should there be more governments intervening and limiting when they have access to these sites?
Well, no, not necessarily. I don't think there should be. The more important answer is that it would be impractical, if not impossible, as a tactic, I think. But I don't think that the governments which are trying to confront this problem are necessarily scared of the message that ISIS is putting out, in the sense that it's not a matter of wanting to block what ISIS wants the public to know about them. I think that there is some confidence that at some point, once the full information about ISIS comes out, it will become a much less desirable group to fly and join. You see that to a certain degree in the different types of ways they're using media for their different goals, so that their recruitment videos look different than their propaganda videos. The recruitment videos are focusing more on babies and kittens, and the propaganda videos more on severed heads. And eventually they're not going to be able to control that message. And as that all comes into the public space, I think there's some confidence that once the brutality and savagery of ISIS and the country that they're trying to create comes to light and is better exposed, that recruitment will dip to a certain degree. Now, of course, other tools are being used to combat recruitment at the same time, but I don't think that controlling information is the answer here.
Okay, so basically they'll defeat themselves simply by showing just how bad they really are.
among myriad ways, I think that
Right.
is, but in one way, I think they will defeat themselves. I mean, that's the natural corollary to what we're talking about in terms of crowdsourcing and outsourcing. The natural corollary to that is a loss of control, right? When something is centrally controlled, there is more control, and when it's more diffusely run, there is less so. So that those sort of things will start to happen more.
So, and Daphne, do you see sort of a kind of an upswing, a surge of people joining ISIS right now? Because it seems like the cool thing to do, but as more people come back and the message gets out that in fact, these guys are psychopaths and that they're doing horrible things. There have been some ISIS defectors who have come back and said, it is not what I signed up for. Do you predict that will begin to happen more and that they may be undone by their own social media?
I'm terrible at predictions, but I would say, I mean, also, just to play off what Zainab was saying, is that, I think, again, sometimes the fandom and the magnification of that may end up kind of dissipating and not truly being enough to kind of move that movement over the next hill that they're hoping to conquer. I think that's really the question, is where are they headed on the ground, and is social media going to take them to the next level? Is the recruitment that they can come up with using those tools going to take them further than they can get just on their own on the ground? And I think, that has yet to be borne out. I think one of the things it sounds like also just to think about is, like, is social media a level playing field for both ISIS and counterterrorism? I mean, is there a way to kind of counteract what they're doing through social media also? I really like the answer that, you shouldn't be able to kind of control the information, but, can you use it in a way to counter? And it sort of sounds like Patrick was saying no.
Well, it's a hedged no. I just think it's probably not worth the effort. I don't think you don't want to surrender the space, but you have to look at it two ways. The governments that are being threatened by ISIS do not care about the social media. They're not cared about virtual reality. They're cared about actual reality. And so social media is for people that are, by definition, removed from the problem, and that can go to that. And so it's a luxury we have that we're worried about Twitter instead of them actually taking our village. And so, but again, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out effective ways to counter what is basically a cool message, of violence, which we can all say the moral reasons why it's not very good, but if you start getting into that, then you get into the ideological discussions about what does Muqdisi say about that. And that, that's important, and you got to fight it at that level. But at the social media level, they are not reading Quranic verses and arguing. Some of them do, but for the most part, they talk about it like Monday Night Football. They really do. And so when the government tries to craft a big counter-narrative social media, talking social media, not traditional, it doesn't work because it's from the government. And the Department of State does a lot of good work, but they're speaking to people that agree with the Department of State. By definition, if you are reading that, you have decided to follow Department of State, and you already agree with them, or you want to use it to mock them. And so is it worth the effort? I don't know. I think that there are a lot of other ways that are low-tech to combat a high-tech problem.
Okay. So, Matthew, as somebody who's with the JTTF and a specialist in online terrorism, how do you go and look at what is being said on Twitter, how social media is being used take us through sort of the investigative process in your head when you're looking at all of this.
Sure. There are a couple of things we have to take into account before we begin to just randomly look at online things. One is the scope. We have to be efficient in what we do. Just trolling Facebook or Twitter for pro-ISIS quotes is not going to be the best way to identify the people we need to worry about. We have to worry about First Amendment protected rights as well. People are allowed to say they hate America. That's not illegal. That's not wrong to say. They can say they want Sharia law in the United States. They're more than welcome to try to get a congressman who will try to institute that. So I don't think it's going to be highly successful, but they certainly have that right. So we can't just look at that and go, this is a bad person because he says ISIS is good. There's got to be more to it for us. And there are certainly things internally that we don't want to fully discuss. But if they start to talk about violence, and violence in a scale that, yeah, we need to bring violence here because this is the way to affect change, that's certainly going to get our attention. You can't say we need to bring Sharia here by the sword. You can't. That is illegal. Bringing Sharia here by the sword would be a big problem. So we have to go along routes like that. And a lot of it is, Facebook is massive, Twitter is massive, Tumblr is massive. I mean, you're looking at me, the numbers for the FBI, we have 13,000 agents in the entire country. The NYPD has 40,000 officers. They don't all work counterterrorism. Most of us don't work counterterrorism. So we're a small subset of what we work. So we have to be efficient at what we do. And it's just like any investigation, really, into anything. We rely on people in these communities that know who the bad people are. We don't care about the average kid, the average Muslim child that is seeing this. We need to know who's actually a problem. I mean, you're allowed to view ISIS stuff online. I agree with the other panelists. I don't think shutting it down is the way to go. It's a double-edged sword. It helps us because now we know who's out there. If we shut it down, they go and hide in their caves. I kind of compare it to Germany to an extent with their white supremacist problem. They've banned anything Nazi-related, white supremacist-related, so they've pushed these people away so that they don't know where they are. At least if we have this, we don't know where they are, but we know where a starting point is. We can always go there to find them. So it's good in a way for us to have that. I mean, it's bad because it gets the message out. I mean, I think the print edition of Inspire would be a lot less effective than the digital one, but to have that there helps us. So we know where they are, and what we'll do is we'll start with following the big people over there, like you were talking about, the ideologues whose message is really important. So we'll start with al-Baghdadi and see who's following him on Twitter. But then we'll kind of compare that to who else is following what and who's very popular and go from there. It's very difficult to identify the guy that is sitting in his mom's basement and sees a message where ISIS claims you should go out and do anything you can to harm the United States. If that guy hasn't communicated with anyone, it's going to be almost impossible. I compare them to the Unabomber. It took us 20 years to find the Unabomber. Maybe it would have been quicker with the internet. But again, how did we find the Unabomber? Someone who knew him, who read his manifesto, said, wait a minute, that sounds like my brother. And that's what happened. And it's kind of the same thing here. We need people to help us. And we have techniques we use on our own without people helping us, various SIGINT capabilities that we use with a warrant and everything else. But it comes back to people helping us and us helping them to make sure no one gets hurt, because that's what it really comes down to at the end of the day.
Yeah, and 2 points on that. The Unabomber, I think all he had was a typewriter, right? He didn't even go online, so he would have been impossible, period.
Yeah.
But also, talking about something that was mentioned earlier, and that is the Hatchet Man, as we're referring to, is very interesting because that happened about a week ago, and we saw that playing out. And initially it was terrorism, and then it was, well, he definitely thought he was a terrorist. And then as they began to really look into his digital footprint, it became very clear that he'd been accessing a lot of different things online, and that he was either cycling deeper into this madness, or he was using sort of a justification. Zainab, when you think about the people you have prosecuted and the ideology behind it, how are they, sort of switching gears a little bit, how are they radicalized, and how do you see the radicalization process changing now in terms of whether there's less of a need to connect with somebody face to face and much more of this anonymous online community, which is where a lot of criminals tend to gather?
Well, I think the lesser need to connect with someone physically obviously makes it easier, and it also can sort of affect the chicken and egg dynamics of the situation, which is that someone who considers themselves a recruiter has to do more work to go out and find potential recruits when he or she in fact needs to interface with those recruits. Whereas I think what you see happening now is people who are kind of interested or just curious can go and seek out, they're the ones going and seeking out the message, and so they almost do a lot of the legwork of the recruiter in terms of connecting themselves with the right people and the right information. But in terms of the motivations and the radicalization processes that we've seen, a lot of it is what we've been talking about today, which is people being connected with messages put out and directed towards them by various terrorist groups. So in the case of the 3 individuals who were convicted of plotting to bomb the New York City subways and who had trained with Al-Qaeda in Waziristan, they had, while they were still here and before they went to Waziristan, been listening to example for sermons of 2 sermons of Anwar al-Awlaki. So that was part of the radicalization process. But the the second half of it, I think, completed once they got there, because they'd considered joining other groups and undertaking other types of activities, and were convinced to do a suicide plot on behalf of al-Qaeda when they interfaced with leadership in Waziristan, who convinced them to do that. So I still think that in terms of mounting the sort of spectacular attacks that al-Qaeda continues to pride itself on, there will need to be some face-to-face discussion and training, because of what we've seen is the sort of attacks where people are entirely self-radicalized and self-motivated and lack any central coordination control can tend to differ in kind from those that are more centrally planned.
Sure, which is, and that's the comparison of a 9/11, for example, or even the underwear bomber plot, where he traveled to Yemen and then met with people with the expectation of blowing up a jetliner on Christmas Day, as opposed to somebody who runs out of his home with a hatchet and finds, with an axe and finds a couple of police officers and then goes after them. Although in Ottawa that was pretty dramatic, simply because he picked a fabulous backdrop. I mean, I hate to say it. It had all the,
Right, although, I mean, the failure of the underwear bomber is itself instructive, because as you point out, he did travel to Yemen, he did receive training on using that device and on detonating it and on operational security, and he still failed despite that extensive training. So that could give you a sense of how somebody who doesn't even have access to that training would fare in a similar situation, someone who's just using the online explosives manual.
which would be somebody like Faisal Shahzad and the Times Square bomber, where I think he learned how to build that sort of car bomb online, if I'm correct. Right, which failed. He had a problem with the fertilizer and the detonator. Anyway, so Daphne, when you think about social media and the use of social media, there are other things that are being done. For example, some have argued, analysts have said, well, ISIS is using different apps to basically show that they've got many more supporters than they really do, or they're going around normal social media using these sort of apps where they can speak anonymously. Talk to us about that role.
Sure, a little bit like using certain Twitter apps, which makes it easier to recruit or to have anonymous followers, to get out their message a little bit more quickly, using all kinds of sort of hashtag battles that take a long time to figure out, and where are they starting from, and who's getting enticed by them. I thought of two other things too with the social media. One is just the idea of constantly kind of recording yourself and your organization and your success, and wanting to message that is a big part, I think, of not just social media, but the generation that's digitally native to it. And that does include ISIS and does
terror
include its
selfies
fighters.
is what you're talking about.
Yeah, terror selfies. I mean, I think a lot, that is a big part of not just the propaganda, but also the recruitment, and it's very easy to do and share online, both through some of these tools and also the ones that Patrick talked about. The one thing I would say about the Unabomber example, as opposed to the Boston bombing, is, I wondered if if in the age of every single person owning, a camera on their phone, if the Unabomber would have taken 20 years in the same way. Whereas I think, Boston, and I'm sort of excluding the manhunt that followed, but certainly the ability to identify somebody so quickly was a result not just of everyone having cameras, but of social media, of everybody being able to share so quickly everything that they had. And I think that in that way it can be sort of helpful, again, on that question of sort of terrorism and counterterrorism and how the tools are being used in different ways. But I do think that the fact that the apps and the different social media outlets, and we didn't talk about Snapchat, but that's obviously extremely significant.
Talk about that. Yeah.
So Snapchat, for anybody who has a teenager and knows anybody who is under 20, Snapchat is, you can share information very quickly, and it disappears from your phone. And it's very popular and very easy to use, and a little bit more difficult to go back and get, not as easy as looking in somebody's Facebook profile. And of course Twitter, yes, you can look at who's following whom, but you don't actually need to follow anybody officially to kind of read their Twitter stream You know, you can happily set up lists and look at all kinds of people without them ever knowing that they're a follower of yours or you of them. So I think, you know, some of these things are an advantage, but some of the things I think are probably an advantage to law enforcement too.
Yeah, so social media being used as an investigative tool, basically.
Yeah, and I think,
So-
you know, and I was thinking for journalists, like if you look at who's following those accounts, you'll probably find a lot of reporters following those accounts.
You know, and the interesting thing, you know, you talk about how do you siphon out what's important, what's not important. I think ultimately there were pages of Jakar Tsarnaev's Twitters and his communication that was released, and there was one in September that said, well, you know, we shouldn't be smoking, you know, at the Boston Marathon or something like that, and it's got to be a little bit frustrating because there is so much out there, but the question is, how do you identify what makes sense and what doesn't make sense? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it is obviously a huge haystack with, sometimes you don't even know that there's a needle in it.
Right.
And it's certainly like anything else in life, you can look back on and go, oh, well, look what he said here, and look what he said here, and recreate steps. It's much easier to recreate steps when you know where to get to. So it's just something that we have to be vigilant on. It's something that we watch, and then we've seen it before. Hopefully we know where people are in the radicalization spectrum. It's certainly not just going to be their social media account. I mean, if someone one day puts out one silly Twitter post, that's probably not going to get our attention. I mean, unless it's I'm going to blow up NASDAQ, then yeah, that might get our attention.
This stuff is in my basement.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So it goes along those lines where you have to look at a totality of the circumstances around it. Is this the, you know, star quarterback of the high school football team saying, I'm the bomb? Then yeah, it's probably not a problem. But if it's a kid that's alone in his basement and his other interests online kind of stream towards that, or actually doesn't have any other interests online, that might be something for us to highlight. I mean, if he's on there and he's following an ISIS Twitter, but also, you know, a comic book thing and something else that kids of that age are into, we have to look at everything, and it is hard to do. I mean, we certainly don't have it down to a science. If we did, we wouldn't have any problems, and I could say that we have it solved and everyone can go home and we'll go to the bar after this. But it's something we need to look at, and it's tough for us because we don't want to look at everyone's Facebook for various reasons, legal ones. Also, I don't need to look at every 17-year-old kid's Twitter.
Very dull.
Yeah, exactly. I don't understand what they're watching on television. I don't understand why they post videos of themselves doing things that they do. And it goes to that point of there's also a generational gap a little bit in how old we all are up here. Not that any of us are old, but we are all older than the average ISIS supporter. So it's the same way that parents don't understand why the kids like rock and roll. That's kind of like what it is for us as well. So we go from there with it, and we learn that just like everyone else, the media is the same way as we are. We look at things, we go, oh, this guy might be important, and we certainly have our hits and misses, and then we go talk to them. You are not going to get arrested based on your Twitter post alone unless it is threatening someone. If you're saying, I'm going to blow up CNN headquarters, you're probably going to get arrested for that and spoken to. So we go through various stages of investigations to find out who's doing what, if these people are serious and if they're not. So it's a long and lengthy process to figure out who the actual people are.
So I'm going to open it up for questions in just a minute, but I want you to, just each of you, I want to know really what, in terms of social media and how it's being used, what do you want this audience to sort of know and understand, the things that you are thinking about constantly? I'll start with you, unless you want me to start on that end.
No, I think that one thing we just have to keep our eye on is the degree of saturation that ISIS is achieving or these videos are achieving right now, especially given that it's a relatively new phenomenon in terms of the video and the savagery and the publication rate has gone up recently. I think we have to keep our eye on what that degree of saturation means and does not mean. So we have to be careful not to mistake it for ISIS's power or control in the region, and to make sure to use objective measures to figure out what's going on, how many followers they have, how persuasive their message is, other than just how many people are seeing their videos. Because I think, we've all talked on this table of all the different reasons someone would have to see their videos, which is not to say that those things aren't correlated, but I don't think they're perfectly correlated, and that's something worth keeping in mind.
Okay, Daphne?
I would say, social media isn't the place where all the terrorists hang out. But I would go back to the way I started out talking about some of the polling numbers and the impact. And I think impact and reach is, for me, the big takeaway, because it is just so easy to reach so many people. And I do think it is significant that nearly every American, 94% of Americans, know about the beheading of James Foley. Many Americans saw an image from the beheading, either that video or the subsequent ones. And I think that that's just an important thing to remember, that it's creating a sense of real fear that impacts our policies and affects decision making.
Okay. All right.
For me, it's the velocity at which new communication mechanisms come out. I mean, we went from MySpace to Facebook to Twitter to everyone else over the course of a couple of years, and it's just amplified and more quickly happening every day. So for us, one of our large concerns is making sure that we know what the next big app is going to be. And I'm terrible at predictions as well, or I'd be playing the stock market and probably wouldn't be here. But that's our huge concern, is which app is next that we're blind to, that we need to be on, because that's where ISIS has moved to, away from something else.
Okay, and Patrick, finally?
Yeah, I'd say that spending the summer immersed into the ISIS social media, when something's infinite like social media, it's easy to lose perspective. There's nothing to base it off of. And so you read this and you start going, oh my God, ISIS has been mentioned, the hashtag or the thing, 4 million times in a month, which is the average. And then in Arabic, it's like 1.9 million. And you're like, oh my God, the world is ending. And it's a huge problem. And then you go, okay, you type in Justin Bieber and you see that it was mentioned, or he was mentioned 40 million times in a month. And that either restores your faith in humanity or destroys it. But it helps you put it in perspective, that you go, okay, well, it's not all bad. That's what, except for Justin Bieber.
So degree of saturation, impact, velocity, and perspective. Okay, so who's got questions? All right, I'll take this lady.
The cyber war is so immense, but I just was sitting here thinking, what a problem the FBI and Radio Liberty and all the propaganda people have to get people to become attached again to their humanity. I mean, I can't even use the word civilization anymore. It's just impossible. So I just was thinking back, and I said, look, who was nonviolent? So I started thinking of Jesus, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, the Vietnamese war kids. All of these things did change something. They were just as passionate. They had as much tenacity. They died on a cross. They were killed by a Hindu.
So are you talking about a different messaging, a peaceful message dominating?
They don't have a sense of history, because let's face it, Hitler was very organized, and they had a cyber system not like yours, like ours. But if they had what we had today, we'd be, blown apart in 2 minutes. But there have been pictures of the Holocaust and horrible things that we've seen. They lost. Napoleon lost. Think of all the people with all the wars and Moscow in the snow and all of that. They lost. The only people who still have a measure of some success, because Tiananmen Square didn't work with the kids, is China. But I'm thinking, if you want to look at it like a football game, who won, who lost, what's happening, where are we, how are we going to get the kids, what are we doing? We cannot lose the idea of nonviolence, and they don't know anything about that, because
so
the
a different
Quran
messaging.
is talking about it's proper and it's okay to stone people.
Thank you. Thank you. In the back with your hand up. You can talk loudly or wait for the mic.
Just so we're going to win. I mean, make no mistake. We'll beat them the same way we beat the Nazis and communism and everything else. I have no doubt. It'll be hard, but we will win.
Hi, Adam Goldman, Washington Post. This is for Zainab and for Matthew, maybe. Sure. One thing Patrick mentioned was the 14 to 25 demographic. We've been watching those who've been exposed to ISIS, and before that, al-Awlaki. It wasn't just ISIS who created young wannabe jihadists. But looking at the landscape, I'm wondering if the FBI and the Justice Department have figured out a way to deal with this, because the approach seems to be different across the country. In Denver, you have a girl who wants to go to Syria, and the FBI does multiple disruption interviews. And this is public. They went and talked to her family repeatedly. Until the end, she decided she wanted to get on that plane, and they arrested her. In Long Island, I think in January, you're going to sentence a young man named Justin Kalibi. That's a EDNY case. You watched him for 2 years, starting as a minor. He became an adult, and eventually you arrested and charged him. He pleaded guilty. We had 3 girls go off to Germany, right? The director talked about them. I don't believe they've been charged yet, but we know what their intentions were, and they were young. And we also have 2 minors involved in a case in Chicago. That came out too during a court hearing. So I'm wondering, what is this approach, and does it seem to you to be somewhat scattershot based on age or even gender?
No, it doesn't seem to me to be scattershot, sorry. I think the approach is generally to, if we suspect people of being involved in crimes of terrorism, even if it's simply attempting or planning or conspiring to, if they haven't completed that act yet, we investigate them for those crimes. And once we get to a point where we have sufficient evidence to charge them, particularly if they're here in the United States, we charge them. And I think that's the backdrop timeline that's occurring to a lot of the situations you've laid out. And that's not immediate, where the investigation is in terms of gathering sufficient evidence to charge is not immediately obvious at all aspects of the course of the investigation. So that you may think an interview is occurring and then is preceded or 2 months later by an arrest because there was a decision not to arrest at the time the interview was occurring, but that might not in fact be the case. It may well be that there wasn't sufficient evidence to arrest. So I think I can say the general FBI Department of Justice policy when we suspect anybody of a terrorism-related offense is to investigate them, and if we have enough to charge them, to charge them.
Along those lines, you don't hear about the ones where we interview them and then they don't go, right? I mean, obviously that happens. I don't want to scare anyone. It happens. So that's part of it. And also, they have to commit a crime. I mean, we are not the thought police. Just because you like ISIS is not illegal. You know, I mean, that's not what we're here for. I don't think that's what America wants us here for. So they have to do something. And resources are unfortunately limited. The 3 girls in Denver, we cannot watch them 24/7. You know, and that's why they have parents. And not that parents could watch them 24/7 either. But that's kind of the role that parents need to play. And that parent was very good. And my understanding, I have no knowledge of the case outside of the media, is that he noticed immediately when they were gone, all right, they're gone, this is a problem, and he called us, and that's kind of what we need in that type of situation.
Patrick, let me just ask you this question. That is, you know, you think that everybody talks about a digital footprint, the footprint you leave behind, people who are tweeting, all these, you know, you've got IMAX and various methods of communication. I guess one question that I'm always asked is, why can't law enforcement or why can't CIA, why can't they track down the people to locate them exactly where they are dispensing this message? Go to the source. Why isn't that possible?
I mean, if you turn on your geolocating tag on Twitter, it's really easy. You don't have to do anything. Otherwise, you'd have to get into the IP. You'd have to start getting warrants. Overseas, it's really difficult. You'd have to go through liaison. And they're actually getting smarter. You know, in law enforcement, you always catch the dumb people first. Thank God for that. And so the real dangerous ones are the ones that are posting online ways to scrub your metadata from your photographs, from all JPEGs, and they put them out there. And so they tell you step by step, if you use an iOS 8, this is how you erase the metadata or the geographical data from your images. And so as they get wrapped up because they realize, oh, they just geolocated me because of this, they'll use a VPN. If their VPN gets compromised, which is an anonymous way to get online. And if they use that, then they'll just scrub their metadata. The real dangerous ones are the ones like Baghdadi, who you don't see on Twitter. I mean, the real dangerous ones are the guys you do not see on social media. Social media is less for operational, it's more for inspirational.
Okay. Over there, the gentleman in the sweater, colored sweater.
People who are willing to give their lives usually do so because they perceive some sort of injustice. So my question is, what is the persuasive appeal of IS and AQ that induces men to be willing to sacrifice their lives? What is it you're reading?
Anyone want to handle that?
I spent a lot of time dealing with the people like that, and I mean, it sounds like a stock answer, but they were missing something. And in Iraq, there's no shortage of injustice for Sunnis. I mean, there is a legitimate reason why the population is against Maliki's government and now his predecessor or successor. And so there are real reasons, but not everybody responds to injustice the same way. And so you have that happily rare combination of somebody who's psychologically vulnerable combined with a real or an imagined injustice with relentless imagery, and then you play the odds and you get a very small percentage. I mean, I think it's remarkable that in America we have 340 million people, and we had 24 people go, 100 people go. I mean, that's, when I first saw that number, I wanted to stand up and clap. I mean, that's actually, I mean, it's scary if you look at it saying, 100 people against me, but it's 100 people with 300 million people. It's 0.002%. And so people are willing to die because they're hopeless. And there's infinite reasons why. But I dealt with a lot of people, and you could turn them around until they strapped on the vest. You could turn them around by giving them something to do. It sounds.
Okay. Let me swing back and forth over here on the corner. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Listening to all the panelists throughout the day, now we see an evolution in the proliferation of the terrorist organizations from Al-Qaeda to ISIL is a giant leap in technology, in branding, in messaging. What's the solutions to counter the next big thing, which we don't know how big it's going to be, how smart it's going to be, how technologically cutting edge it's going to be? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to go, since who said I know? Okay.
Yeah, it's actually the hardest thing. The answer is don't have a 4-year civil war in the middle of the Middle East. And it sounds like a flip answer, but really, ISIS would have been a lingering problem, but you have a 4-year civil war cancer in the middle of the Middle East. And so you don't have to invent reasons to radicalize these people. They are living in the middle of a civil war, and we can ignore it, but all the other countries around it don't have to. And so the answer is, if you can start alleviating the conditions that give rise to those kind of problems, then you can let them have their messages all they want. The good guys will win. Yeah, well, yeah, at least it did there.
Over there, yeah.
Thank you. Just a question, particularly dealing with the propaganda via execution videos and also the inherent, I guess, hypocrisy of ISIL. 4 people so far, I think 2 journalists who are documenting atrocities committed against the very people ISIL claims to be protecting, Sunni Muslims, and also 2 humanitarian rights workers helping Sunni Muslims. I'm curious as to whether or not the idea of hypocrisy by executing these people is lost on ISIL. And in particular, with this other individual, I think his name is Peter Abdulrahman Kasig, who's a Muslim convert, American citizen. He hasn't been executed, and it's been a much longer time in terms of the period between executions that he's been in custody by ISIL. Do you think they're delaying his execution as a result of an awareness of that hypocrisy, or no?
Patrick?
I don't know anything about the current case, and I won't speak about it. But I don't think that they're concerned about being called hypocrites. It's self-obvious when you cut someone's head off on video proclaiming that you're being peaceful, that they're hypocritical. They're not worried about that. They're not trying to out-logic us. It's not a debate where they say, see, and this happened, and we go, oh, okay, it's not a debate club to them. They don't care. They got what they wanted from it. They got a couple thousand new volunteers maybe, a bunch more attention. They might have gotten the fight with America that they might not want because there's a difference between being a cyber supporter and then being on the end of an airstrike. But I don't think that, I mean, we think, how can they live like that? And again, we're not the target audience. They're not trying to convince anyone in this room to join ISIS. They're convincing people that logic is not a problem. I mean, they don't care about logic. We can use hypocrisy against them and then at a certain high level, but they're not playing at that game. I mean, they might, in fact, they're trying to, with the new videos, make it a little different, but we're just playing a different game than they are.
Okay, sir.
This is to go back to something that you mentioned before, Mr. Skinner, concerning mocking the enemy not, pardon me, not working at all. I spent considerable time traveling for USG overseas. Every continent, every hotel room I checked into, turn on the TV and I'd get three things: CNN, obviously, BBC, and Jerry Springer. And it sounds funny, but it really isn't. Today, Jerry Springer, as far as I know, is still out there on social media. He's been joined by Justin Bieber and Lindsay Lohan and Paris Hilton. Over 30 years, why have we not gotten to understand that we're not mocking people, we are giving people the ammunition with which to mock us? It's like that's an idea that's way out in some other planet. Why do you think that, for the whole panel, why do you think that is? How can it be addressed and remedied? Thank you.
I guess if you only watch Jerry Springer, then you would have a very distorted view. And so that would make you crazy, and I probably would want to become a radical extremist. But I mean, the point is that that's self-selecting, that it gets ratings, and so you have popular taste, which, but you also have PBS and NPR, and so I don't know why they focused on it, but it's probably for the banal reason that they get good ratings, and I don't know a way to counter that, and I don't know if you should try.
Yeah, it was interesting because I happened to be watching the Amazing Race, which I don't usually ever do, but my kids are into it, so I was watching it, and they were in a souk, and they were in Marrakesh, and the souk there, and I thought, oh my God, it's an abomination. We come off so stupid, so culturally illiterate, and culturally insensitive. So I thought to myself, if I'm like a jihadist or a potential jihadist watching this, I'm offended like 4,000 different ways. And I was trying to impress that upon, an 11 and 13-year-old, which really didn't resonate that deeply, but my attempts were there. But I understand what you're saying, because it is very difficult. So, but I think irony and satire are something that can be done and can be done well. We've got time for one more question. So who's got the best question in the room? Stand up. All right, own it.
I just wanted to go back to the concept of fandom and fearlessness. Do you think that ISIS is using this anonymous aspect of social media when they're looking to entice their demographic in recruiting kids? Because if you look small scale, we have kids already learning to use website proxies when they're commenting mean things on YouTube so they don't get in trouble. Or here on campus, we have a popular app called Yik Yak, which is essentially anonymous and location-based Twitter. So if I were to post something right now, everyone in this room, everyone on campus, everyone in the Upper West Side could see it, but they wouldn't know who posted it. Or even when you reference Snapchat, there's an app called Fling, which is same as Snapchat, but it posts to 50 random people across the entire world. So I just wanted to know what kind of a role you think this plays in terrorism on social media when people are more apt to act radically when they're hiding behind a screen.
By the way, I think you need to hire her as an analyst, because I think you just found your next apps.
I mean, we certainly know that ISIS knows which communication methods are more secure and less secure. Without going into too much detail, it's not lost on them that people are stupid on social media sometimes and post things to the world that they shouldn't. So they will certainly guide the people that they want to more secure applications. Whether or not they use Yik Yak or whatever, I'm not sure. If ISIS is using Yik Yak at Fordham, please let me know, because we'll try to take a look at it. But yeah, they absolutely, yes. The answer is yes, in a nutshell.
And that's why they wear masks on their video. It's easier to separate yourself from your action if you don't see your face, and if you're anonymous, so you can be more aggressive. The internet is a highly aggressive people. If you want to see how aggressive, just read comments on anything on YouTube, and then you'll see the dark side of humanity. And so the anonymous nature of the internet mirrors the anonymous nature that they want to present when they wear a mask.
Yeah. Zanat Ahmed, Daphne Linzer, Matthew Maraglia, and Patrick Skinner, thank you so much for a great panel.